Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the delightful, often disgusting, and undeniably difficult world of medieval dating, or rather the distinct lack thereof. Imagine, if you will, waking up in a hovel, the smell of stale straw and unwashed bodies clinging to the air like a persistent fog. You stretch, feeling the ache in your bones from a lifetime of hard labor, and glance out the window, if you even have one. The world outside is a muddy canvas, dotted with livestock and the occasional wandering pig. Your teeth, if you're lucky enough to still possess a full set, probably ache. Your hair. Well, let's just say regular washing wasn't exactly a priority. And as for finding someone special, let's just say your options were limited and often predetermined. There was no swiping left or right here, no carefully curated profiles or awkward first coffee dates. Your future, and the future of your lineage, was probably already decided by someone else, likely over a tankard of ale and a discussion of property lines. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it there? I'm always curious to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a world where the concept of dating, as you understand it today, simply doesn't exist. There are no romantic dinners, no strolls through parks, no awkward first kisses under the stars. Instead, your life, including who you end up with, is intricately woven into the fabric of survival. Societal expectations, and the rigid hierarchy of the time. If you're a peasant, your world is small, confined to your village or manor. Your pool of potential partners is even smaller, limited to those within your immediate community. You're likely to marry someone you've known your entire life, perhaps even someone you're distantly related to. The primary concern isn't love or affection, but practicality. Can this person help work the land while they produce strong, healthy children to ensure your family line continues, and, more importantly, provides more hands for labor? For you, a young woman, your value is often tied to your dowry, the land, goods, or money you bring into the marriage. Without a dowry, your prospects are incredibly slim, often leading to a life of servitude or destitution. Even with a dowry, you have little to no say in who you marry. Your father, or the male head of your household, will make the decision, often based on economic gain or social climbing. He might marry you off to solidify an alliance, to acquire more land, or to settle a debt. Your feelings largely irrelevant. You're a pawn in a larger game of power and property. You might meet your future husband for the first time on your wedding day, a stranger who now holds your future in his hands. Imagine the anxiety, the fear, as you face a lifetime with someone you don't know, someone you haven't chosen, someone whose temperament and habits are a complete mystery. There's no escaping this fate. Divorce is practically unheard of, and societal norms dictate that you must obey your husband in all things. If you're a young man, your situation, while perhaps offering a bit more agency, is still far from the freedom you might imagine. Your family's economic standing dictates your options. If you're a landless peasant, you might spend your entire life as a laborer, perhaps never earning enough to marry or support a family. If you do marry, it's likely to be someone of similar standing, someone who can contribute to the household economy. You need a wife who is strong, capable, and fertile. Love, again, is a secondary concern. Your parents will likely be heavily involved in selecting your bride, ensuring she meets the practical requirements for a successful union. You're expected to be a provider, a protector, and a father. Failure to fulfill these roles brings shame upon your family and potentially dire consequences for your future. Consider the physical realities of your existence. Personal hygiene, as we know it, is a foreign concept. Bathing is infrequent, often a luxury reserved for the wealthy. And even then, it's not a daily ritual. You smell of sweat, wood smoke, and the various animals you interact with daily. Your clothes are likely coarse wool or linen, rarely washed, and probably home to a variety of fleas and lice. Imagine trying to find someone appealing when everyone around you carries the pungent aroma of unwashed bodies and the lingering scent of their daily toil. This isn't to say people didn't find each other attractive, but the standards were vastly different. A strong, healthy body, capable of enduring hard labor and bearing children, was far more desirable than any superficial beauty. The church, a dominant force in medieval life, also heavily influences your romantic prospects. Marriage is a sacrament, a holy union, and it's meant to be lifelong. Any deviation from its strictures is a grave sin. Premarital sex is forbidden, and illegitimate children face social ostracism and often a life of hardship. The church also dictates who you can and cannot marry, with consanguinity blood relation being a significant barrier. Marrying someone too closely related is seen as incestuous and is strictly prohibited, often requiring special dispensations from the church, which are costly and difficult to obtain. This further narrows your options, especially in small, isolated communities where everyone is likely related in some way, even if you manage to find someone you genuinely like. The opportunities for private interaction are almost non-existent. Life is communal. You live in close quarters with your family, often sharing a single room. Privacy is a luxury you can only dream of. Any courtship, if you can even call it that, takes place under the watchful eyes of your family and the entire village. There's no sneaking off for a romantic walk in the woods. Every move you make is observed and judged. Reputation is paramount, especially for women. A hint of impropriety could ruin your chances of a good marriage and bring shame upon your family. So, you learn to be discreet, to communicate in subtle glances and stolen moments. If such moments even present themselves, for the nobility, life is different, but not necessarily better when it comes to personal choice. If you're a lord or lady, your marriage is a political tool, a means to consolidate power, secure alliances, or expand territory. You might be betrothed as a child, your future sealed before you even understand its implications. Your spouse might be from a distant land, speaking a different language, and holding vastly different customs. Love is a rare and often inconvenient byproduct. Certainly not the foundation of the union, while you might have more material comforts. The emotional cost of these arranged marriages can be immense. You're expected to produce heirs, preferably male, to continue the family line and secure the inheritance. Failure to do so can lead to immense pressure, even annulment, which, while rare, is a devastating blow to a woman's standing. Consider the age at which you might marry. For women, it's often as young as 12 or 14, sometimes even younger, in times of crisis or for strategic alliances, though consummation would typically wait until puberty. For men, it's usually later, in their late teens or early 20s. Once they've established some ability to provide for a family, this means you're entering a lifelong commitment at an age when you're barely out of childhood, with little life experience or understanding of what marriage truly entails. There's no time for self-discovery or personal growth before you're thrust into the responsibilities of adulthood and parenthood. You're expected to mature quickly, to embrace your role within the societal structure, and to uphold your family's honor. One common historical misconception is that medieval people were entirely devoid of emotion or affection in their relationships. While love might not have been the primary reason for marriage, it certainly could develop over time. Many unions, initially arranged, grew into affectionate partnerships based on shared experiences, mutual respect, and the necessity of working together to survive. You might find yourself growing fond of your spouse, learning their habits, understanding their strengths and weaknesses. The bond forged through shared hardship and the raising of children could be incredibly strong, even if it wasn't the passionate romance depicted in modern stories. However, if love did blossom outside the confines of marriage, it was often dangerous and fraught with peril, especially for women. Adultery could lead to severe punishment, even death, depending on the region and the social standing of those involved. The societal pressure to conform is immense. If you deviate from the expected path, you face ostracism, ridicule, and potentially worse, there's no room for individualism or self-expression when your life is so intrinsically linked to the community. Everyone knows everyone else's business, and gossip spreads like wildfire. Your reputation, as mentioned, is everything. Especially for women, a single misstep can ruin your life, leaving you an outcast with no prospects. This pressure to adhere to societal norms is a powerful deterrent to any romantic notions that might stray from the accepted path. And let's not forget the sheer boredom that often permeates everyday life. With no media, no easy travel, and repetitive daily tasks, life could be monotonous. This lack of stimulation, ironically, might have made the few social interactions you had even more significant. Perhaps a fleeting glance, a shared laugh during a harvest festival, or a quiet conversation at the well was all you had to fuel any nascent feelings. But these moments were rare and always under the watchful eye of the community. You learned to communicate with subtlety, with coded gestures and veiled words. A delicate dance in a world where overt expressions of affection were often seen as inappropriate or even dangerous. Historians still debate the true extent of affection in medieval marriages, while anecdotal evidence and romantic literature from the period suggest that love could exist. The pragmatic realities of survival and social order often overshadowed individual desires. Was it a world devoid of love? No. But it was a love often born of necessity and companionship rather than passionate romance. You learned to appreciate the person you were given, to find common ground, and to build a life together. Not necessarily on a foundation of hearts and flowers, but on shared labor and mutual survival. The idea of dating for love is a relatively modern invention, born out of changing social structures and economic prosperity that allowed for greater individual choice. In your medieval reality, love was a luxury, and often a happy accident. You wake with the same lingering scent of damp earth and wood smoke. But today, a new, more pervasive odor seems to permeate the air. The distinct, acrid tang of human waste and general bodily effluvia. Welcome to the medieval world's relationship with hygiene. Or more accurately, its utter lack thereof. Your skin, perpetually coated in a fine layer of grime, feels rough to the touch. Your hair, an untamed mass, likely harbors a small, unseen ecosystem of its own. Daily bathing as you know it is a fantasy for the vast majority. A full-body wash might happen a few times a year, perhaps in a nearby stream, or, if you're lucky, in a shared wooden tub where the water is passed from person to person, elder to child, until it's more mud than water. Imagine the collective aroma of an entire village, all existing in various states of unwashness. It's a scent that would overpower even the strongest modern perfume, even for the wealthy. Cleanliness was a relative term. Lords and ladies might have had access to warm water, herbs, and even early forms of soap made from animal fats and lye. But bathing was still infrequent. It was often seen as a therapeutic or medicinal activity rather than a daily ritual. Personal cleanliness wasn't linked to health in the way we understand it today. The concept of germs was centuries away. Instead, illness was often attributed to imbalances of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, or to divine punishment. So, why bother with a daily scrub if it wasn't going to ward off the plague? You simply learn to live with the pervasive smells, the itching, and the constant companionship of fleas and lice. These tiny creatures were not a sign of poor personal habits. They were simply an accepted part of life. You'd see people casually picking them off themselves or their neighbors. A routine pastime. Consider your teeth. Forget toothbrushes and toothpaste. Your dental hygiene routine, if it even existed, might involve rubbing your teeth with a rough cloth, or perhaps chewing on certain herbs to freshen your breath. Cavities were rampant, leading to chronic pain and infections. If a tooth became too painful, the only recourse was extraction, often performed by a local blacksmith or barber. Without anesthesia, imagine the agony, the raw nerve endings, the sheer terror of having a tooth yanked out with crude tools. Many medieval skulls show widespread dental decay and abscesses, a testament to the constant suffering people endured. And bad breath, it was a given. When everyone's teeth are rotting and their diets consist of rough, often poorly cooked foods. Sweet-smelling breath is a rare luxury. This pervasive halitosis would have been another delightful component of medieval social interactions. Then there's the issue of human waste. In the bustling towns and cities, sanitation systems were virtually non-existent. People would simply empty their chamber pots out of windows onto the streets below, or into open gutters that ran through the middle of thoroughfares. Imagine trying to navigate a city street, constantly dodging falling refuse and stepping around puddles of stagnant sewage. The smell would be overwhelming. A potent cocktail of human and animal waste, rotting garbage, and general decay. In rural areas, things were only marginally better. Latrines were often communal pits, or people would simply relieve themselves in fields or near streams. Contaminating water sources. The idea of flushing toilets in modern sewer systems wouldn't come for hundreds of years. This constant exposure to fecal matter and other waste was a major contributor to the spread of disease. Diseases, therefore, were an ever-present specter. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, is perhaps the most famous example, but it was far from the only killer. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, measles, and a host of other ailments were endemic. Childhood mortality rates were astronomically high. It was not uncommon for half or more of your children to die before reaching adulthood. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and medical knowledge was primitive at best. Barber surgeons performed rudimentary operations, often without any understanding of sterilization, leading to rampant infections. Bloodletting, based on the humoral theory, was a common treatment for almost any ailment, often weakening the patient further. You lived in a constant state of vulnerability, knowing that a simple cut could fester, a common cold could turn into pneumonia, and a seemingly minor illness could quickly become a death sentence. Consider the role of public health, or rather the complete absence of it. There were no public health initiatives, no understanding of epidemiology, no quarantines in the modern sense, though some attempts were made during outbreaks. When an epidemic struck, people would often flee, inadvertently spreading the disease further. Your fate was largely in the hands of God or fate, not human intervention. The average lifespan, when factoring in high infant mortality, was shockingly low, perhaps in the mid-30s. If you survived childhood, you might live longer, but your body would likely be ravaged by years of hard labor. Poor nutrition and chronic illness. This lack of sanitation also impacted the spread of parasites. Intestinal worms were incredibly common, affecting nearly everyone. These parasites would sap your energy, contribute to malnutrition, and cause chronic discomfort. You'd also contend with various skin ailments, from scabies to ringworm, all exacerbated by poor hygiene and close living conditions. The constant itching, the visible lesions, the general discomfort of these conditions would have been a daily reality, one fascinating, yet often overlooked. Detail is the medieval approach to washing clothes. unlike today, where you simply toss soiled items into a machine. Medieval laundry was an arduous process. Clothes were often made of wool, which is difficult to clean and slow to dry. They might be beaten, scrubbed with lye or stale urine, which contains ammonia and acts as a bleaching agent, and then rinsed in a stream or a river. This process was time-consuming and labor-intensive, meaning clothes were washed infrequently, further contributing to the general lack of cleanliness and the harboring of pests. Imagine living in clothes that were rarely, if ever, truly clean. The faint scent of old sweat, dirt, and whatever was used to clean them would cling to you constantly. Historians still debate whether medieval people were truly oblivious to the link between filth and disease, or simply resigned to it. While the scientific understanding of germ theory was absent, there was some rudimentary awareness that certain conditions seemed to breed illness. For example, some city ordinances attempted to regulate the disposal of waste. Though these were often poorly enforced, however, the sheer scale of the problem, coupled with a lack of resources and scientific understanding, made any widespread improvement virtually impossible. You simply lived with it, learned to tolerate it, and hoped you were lucky enough to avoid the worst of the plagues. So, when you think about romance in this era, remember that any intimate moment would have been accompanied by a symphony of smells, the omnipresent itch of fleas, and the constant underlying threat of illness. Your loved one might have a mouth full of decaying teeth, their breath a potent reminder of their latest meal, and their skin covered in a sheen of grime. Love truly had to conquer all in medieval times, including a distinct lack of personal freshness. It's a stark reminder that what we consider basic necessities today, clean water, sanitation, and medical care, were unimaginable luxuries for the vast majority of people during this period. You stumble through the mud-caked streets, perhaps heading to the market, and as you observe those around you, a crucial truth becomes glaringly obvious in the medieval world. Fashion wasn't about personal expression, it was a loud, unmissable declaration of your social status. Every stitch, every color, every accessory or lack thereof screamed your position in the rigid hierarchy of society. Your clothes weren't just fabric. They were a uniform, dictating where you belonged, who you could interact with, and even what you were legally allowed to wear. Try to imagine a world where a quick glance at someone's attire instantly tells you if they're a lord or a serf, a merchant or a monk. There were no hidden surprises, no breaking down barriers. Your clothing cemented them, and often, these garments were anything but comfortable. If you're a peasant, like the vast majority of the population, your wardrobe is simple, practical, and utterly devoid of frills. You're likely clad in rough, undyed wool or coarse linen. The colors are muted, browns, grays, dull greens, the natural tones of the fibers. Your garments are designed for utility and durability, meant to withstand the relentless demands of agricultural labor. For a man, this typically means a tunic that reaches to your knees, belted at the waist, worn over simple breeches or leggings. For a woman, a long, shapeless gown, often layered for warmth, perhaps covered by an apron. Shoes are sturdy, often made of leather, or perhaps just simple wraps for your feet, offering minimal protection from the elements. Comfort is secondary to function, and warmth is a constant battle. Imagine wearing the same heavy, scratchy wool for months on end, rarely washed, accumulating sweat, dirt, and the lingering smell of the farm. Your clothes are an extension of your hard life, a visual representation of your daily toil. Now, ascend the social ladder a bit, to the burgeoning merchant class. Here, you start to see a subtle shift. While still practical, merchants could afford finer fabrics, perhaps dyed with slightly more vibrant, though still muted, colors, linen undergarments, worn closer to the skin, might offer a rare touch of softness. Their clothes are still designed for functionality, as they are often traveling or working in shops. But there's a definite step up in quality and, dare we say, a hint of aspiration. They might wear more tailored tunics, or perhaps even a form of early doublet. Their shoes might be better crafted, their accessories more refined. This is where you see the beginnings of fashion as a statement, a way to subtly distinguish oneself from the lower classes, even if it's not yet the extravagant displays of the nobility. And then, there are the nobles, the lords, ladies, knights, and the upper clergy. Their clothing is a spectacle, a dazzling display of wealth, power, and often, inconvenience. Sumptuary laws, which dictated what different social classes were permitted to wear, were strictly enforced, precisely to prevent commoners from mimicking the elite. If you were caught wearing colors or fabrics reserved for your betters, you could face severe penalties, from fines to public humiliation. For a noble, your clothes are made from the finest materials: silks, velvets, and imported brocades. The colors are rich and vibrant, deep reds from madder root, brilliant blues from woad, luxurious purples reserved almost exclusively for royalty due to the exorbitant cost of the dye often derived from snails. These dyes were incredibly expensive and difficult to produce, making them immediate status symbols. Imagine a lady adorned in a gown of shimmering crimson silk, perhaps embroidered with gold thread, its long, sweeping train dragging through the inevitably dirty castle floors, or a knight in richly colored tunics adorned with heraldic devices, his expensive armor polished to a sheen. Their garments are often elaborately cut and fitted, requiring skilled tailors and vast amounts of fabric. Consider the sheer impracticality of some of these noble fashions. Women's gowns often featured long, trailing sleeves or trains that would catch on everything and become incredibly dirty. Headwear could be elaborate and heavy, towering constructions adorned with jewels and veils. Men's doublets could be restrictive, and their hose tights might be tight and unforgiving. Layering was common, adding bulk and heat, especially indoors. Comfort was entirely secondary to appearance and the projection of power. You wore what was expected of you, a walking billboard for your family's prestige and wealth. One minor, amusing detail is the medieval fondness for poulaines, those ridiculously long, pointed shoes that became fashionable among the nobility in the 14th and 15th centuries. The longer your toe, the higher your status, to the point where they could be so long they had to be stuffed with moss or whalebone, and sometimes even chained to your knee to prevent tripping. Imagine trying to walk, dance, or even just climb stairs in shoes that extend a foot or more beyond your toes. It's a hilarious example of fashion triumphing over all common sense. Even undergarments were status symbols. While peasants wore simple linen shifts or braised loose breeches, nobles might have more finely woven linen, sometimes even silk for the very wealthy, providing a thin barrier between their skin and the coarser outer layers. But again, these weren't washed daily. They were often worn for extended periods, simply aired out and then worn again. The smell, even among the elite, would likely still be far from pleasant by modern standards. Jewelry, though not strictly clothing, played a massive role in medieval fashion as a sign of wealth. Rings, brooches, necklaces, and belts were often crafted from gold and silver, adorned with precious gemstones. These weren't just decorative, they were often investments, portable wealth that could be pawned or traded in times of need. The more glittering jewels you wore, the more significant your standing. Even hair, especially for noble women, was an important part of their overall presentation. Elaborate braids, often interwoven with ribbons or pearls, were common, covered by veils or intricate coiffes as a sign of modesty and status once married. Unmarried noblewomen often wore their hair long and unbound, a symbol of their youth and availability. Historians still debate the extent to which sumptuary laws were truly effective at controlling fashion and social mobility. While they were enacted with great fervor, there's evidence that people sometimes found ways around them, subtly altering their attire to mimic a higher status without overtly breaking the law. Perhaps a peasant would find a scrap of dyed wool and incorporate it into their simple tunic, or a merchant might wear a slightly more elaborate buckle than strictly permitted. These small acts of defiance highlight the human desire for upward mobility and the innate push against rigid social stratification. Even in an era where such desires could be dangerous, so the next time you pick out an outfit, consider the freedom you have. You can wear whatever you want, mix and match styles, express your individuality. In the medieval world, your clothes were a cage, albeit a beautifully gilded one for the very few, and a rough, scratchy one for the vast majority. You wore your place in the world on your sleeve, quite literally, and dared not to stray from its rigid dictates. It's a powerful reminder that our personal choices, even in something as seemingly trivial as clothing, are a relatively recent luxury. You feel the rumble in your stomach, a familiar companion in this medieval existence. It's a low, persistent growl that serves as a constant reminder of life's fundamental struggle acquiring enough to eat. In the medieval world, food wasn't just sustenance, it was a gamble, a constant negotiation with nature, and a stark indicator of your place in society. Forget the convenience of grocery stores or diverse menus. Your diet was largely dictated by the seasons, the land you lived on, and, most importantly, your social standing. You lived with the ever-present shadow of famine, a devastating reality that could wipe out entire communities, far more effectively than any army. If you are a peasant, your diet is monotonous and meager. The staple of your existence is grain, primarily barley or rye, often made into a coarse bread or pottage, a thick, often watery, stew. Imagine eating the same dry, hard bread every single day, perhaps supplemented by a bowl of gruel. Vegetables, when available, are root vegetables like carrots, parsnips, and onions, or cabbage, all grown in your small plot or foraged from the common land. Meat is a rare luxury, perhaps a scrawny chicken or a bit of dried fish if you live near a river or coast. Hunting is generally forbidden for commoners on noble lands. So, poaching becomes a risky, desperate act of survival. Protein for you often comes from pulses like peas and beans, which are relatively easy to grow and store. Dairy, if you have a cow or goat, means milk often consumed as cheese or butter. As fresh milk spoils quickly, foraging is crucial, especially in lean times. You learn which berries, nuts, and wild greens are safe to eat. A vital knowledge passed down through generations. Your meals are functional, designed to provide just enough energy for the relentless manual labor that defines your days. There's little joy in eating, just the necessity of filling your belly. Consider the act of preparing food. There's no gas stove or electric oven. Cooking is done over an open hearth, requiring constant attention and skill to manage the fire. Bread is baked in communal ovens, a social ritual as much as a practical one. You grind your own grain, a back-breaking task, or pay the miller, taking a portion of your precious harvest. Every meal is a testament to immense effort and resourcefulness. Now, shift your gaze to the tables of the nobility. Here, the bounty is staggering, a feast for the senses, and a deliberate display of power and wealth. Their diet is rich in meat-roasted venison, wild boar, various fowl like swans and peacocks often served with their feathers reattached for dramatic effect, and abundant fish on fast days. Spices, imported from exotic lands and incredibly expensive, are used liberally to flavor and preserve food, signaling immense wealth. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper transform mundane ingredients into culinary masterpieces. Imagine the aromatic clouds drifting from their kitchens, a stark contrast to the bland fare of the common folk. Bread for the nobility is made from finely milled wheat flour, creating a white, soft loaf, a symbol of their refined tastes. Vegetables and fruits are also more varied and plentiful, but still largely seasonal. Honey is the primary sweetener, as sugar is a luxury beyond imagination. Wine and ale flow freely, consumed by adults and children alike, as water sources are often contaminated. The rich drink fine wines, while commoners make do with weaker, often sour. Ale or cider, feasts are elaborate affairs, showcasing the Lord's generosity and power. Courses are numerous, each more extravagant than the last, accompanied by music, entertainment, and often, much drunken revelry. These meals are not just about eating, they are social events, political gatherings, and a chance to display dominance. Eating utensils are minimal, you eat with your hands, perhaps using a knife for cutting, and communal spoons, forks, a relatively late invention, are still a rarity. Imagine the messy, hearty consumption, surrounded by the clatter of plates and the boisterous laughter of the privileged. However, even for the wealthy, dining isn't without its perils. Food preservation methods are rudimentary, salting, smoking, and drying are common. But food spoilage is a constant threat. Without refrigeration, meat and dairy can quickly turn, leading to food poisoning, rich, noble diets, heavy in meat and lacking in fresh produce, often led to health issues like gout, a painful inflammatory arthritis caused by high uric acid levels. So, while they avoided starvation, they faced their own distinct dietary ailments. One intriguing aspect often overlooked is the concept of fasting. The Church imposed numerous fast days throughout the year, especially during Lent and Advent, and often on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. On these days, meat, dairy, and sometimes even eggs were forbidden. For peasants, this meant an even leaner diet of fish and vegetables. For the wealthy, it was a challenge for their cooks to create elaborate, meat-free dishes that still showcased their abundance. This religious obligation shaped the dietary patterns of everyone, rich and poor, influencing agricultural cycles and culinary traditions. Historians still debate the actual nutritional value of medieval diets, while peasant diets often appear lacking by modern standards. They were typically high in fiber and contained a good range of vitamins and minerals from grains and vegetables. Assuming sufficient quantity, the noble diet, while rich, could be unbalanced, leading to nutrient deficiencies despite the apparent abundance. The challenge for everyone was consistency and quantity, having enough food, day in and day out. Regardless of the season or unforeseen circumstances like bad harvests or warfare, so, as you drift off, remember the daily grind of medieval hunger. Whether you were constantly chasing enough calories to survive another day of grueling labor, or indulging in an endless array of rich meats that might eventually cripple you with gout. Food was a central, defining, and often precarious element of your medieval life. The ease with which we access diverse might safe, and plentiful food today would be an absolute miracle to your medieval self. You stand before the altar, the scent of stale incense mingling with the ever-present odor of unwashed bodies. Your heart might pound, or perhaps it's merely a dull ache, a resignation to the inevitable. For in the medieval world, love, marriage, and property were inextricably intertwined, a cold, hard calculus where personal affection was a rare and often inconvenient variable. This wasn't about finding your soulmate, it was about securing your future, your lineage, and your economic standing. You were a pawn in a much larger game, played by families, feudal lords, and the strict dictates of the church. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, marriage was a practical necessity. It was less a romantic union and more an economic partnership. You needed a spouse to help work the land, produce children to ensure hands for future labor, and provide mutual support in a harsh world. If you were a young man, you needed a wife who was strong, fertile, and industrious, If you were a young woman, your primary value was often your ability to bring a dowry, however meager or failing that, your capacity for hard work and childbearing. Marriages were typically arranged by families, often with the input of the village elders or the lord of the manor. Love might grow over time, born of shared hardship and the common goal of survival, but it rarely, if ever, initiated the union. Imagine marrying someone you've known your entire life, not out of passion, but because your families deemed it practical. There was no escaping this reality. Divorce was almost impossible, and abandonment meant social ruin and often destitution. Consider the specifics of these arrangements. For peasant families, a marriage might be solidified by a few pigs, a patch of land, or a promise of future labor. These were not grand affairs, but simple ceremonies, often conducted locally, and primarily focused on securing the economic viability of the new household. The concept of dating for pleasure or to find a romantic connection simply didn't exist. Any interaction between young, unmarried individuals would be heavily supervised, often within communal settings like harvest festivals or church gatherings. Reputation was paramount, especially for women. Any hint of impropriety could ruin a woman's chances of marriage and bring shame upon her entire family. Now, ascend the social hierarchy to the noble class. Here, the stakes were infinitely higher, and personal choice was even more constrained. If you were born into a noble family, your marriage was almost certainly an arranged alliance, a strategic move on a geopolitical chessboard. Daughters were valuable commodities, used to forge alliances, gain territory, or solidify peace treaties. Sons were married off to secure powerful family connections or to inherit wealth. You might be betrothed as a child, perhaps even before you could walk. Your future irrevocably linked to someone you had never met, someone from a distant land. Speaking a foreign tongue, imagine being a young noblewoman, perhaps just 12 or 13 years old, told you are to marry a man twice your age, solely to secure your father's political ambitions. Your feelings are irrelevant. Your duty is to your family, to produce heirs, particularly male ones, to continue the lineage and inherit the vast estates. Failure to produce a male heir could lead to immense pressure, even to annulment, though rarely a full divorce, which would be a devastating blow to a woman's standing and future prospects. Dowries for noblewomen were enormous, often comprising vast tracts of land, substantial sums of money, or valuable goods, all to be handed over to her husband's family. This made noble daughters incredibly valuable, but also stripped them of any independent financial power within the marriage. For noblemen, while they might have had slightly more say in the selection of a bride, their choices were still heavily dictated by family interests and political expediency. They needed a wife who brought a substantial dowry, who was from a respectable and powerful family, and who was capable of bearing strong, healthy children. Love, again, was a bonus, not a prerequisite. Knights might fight bravely in tournaments, but their true battles for a future were fought in the marriage negotiations of their parents. The church played a pivotal role in regulating marriage. It defined marriage as a holy sacrament, indissoluble and lifelong. This meant that once you were married for good. Divorce, as we understand it, did not exist. Annulment, a declaration that the marriage was never valid in the first place, often due to consanguinity. Coercion, or non-consummation, was rare, difficult to obtain, and usually only pursued by the very wealthy and powerful with significant political influence. This permanence meant that you had to make your marriage work. Whatever the personal cost, there was no escape. Consider the role of concubinage among the nobility. While marriage was sacred, it wasn't uncommon for noblemen to have mistresses and illegitimate children. While these children couldn't inherit legitimate titles or lands, they might be acknowledged and even provided for. especially if the legitimate wife failed to produce male heirs. For women, however, the consequences of illicit relationships were far more severe, ranging from social ruin to legal penalties, even death. Depending on the circumstances and local laws, the double standard was stark and unforgiving. One fascinating aspect is the medieval understanding of courtly love, particularly in the High Middle Ages. This was an idealized, often non-consummated, form of love between a knight and a married noblewoman, celebrated in literature and poetry. It was an intellectual and spiritual connection, focusing on chivalry, devotion, and admiration from afar, rather than physical intimacy. While this concept suggests a romantic yearning, it was largely confined to literary circles and elite entertainment, providing an emotional outlet that official marriages often lacked. It rarely, if ever, translated into actual marriage arrangements and certainly didn't challenge the patriarchal structures of the time. Historians still debate the true impact and prevalence of courtly love outside of poetic ideals. Was it a genuine cultural phenomenon influencing real emotions? Or merely a literary trope? A fantasy for the bored nobility? So, as you settle into slumber, reflect on the profound difference in how relationships were forged in medieval times. Your romantic destiny wasn't yours to choose, it was a preordained path, dictated by economics, lineage, and the relentless pursuit of property. You were a piece in a complex puzzle, and your personal desires often had to be sacrificed for the greater good of your family and your survival in a world that offered little room for individual sentiment. You hear the faint cries of a newborn, a fragile sound that cuts through the ever-present hum of daily life. This isn't a moment of unbridled joy as you might imagine today. It's a moment of immense vulnerability, a stark reminder that childhood in medieval times was a perilous journey, far removed from modern-day innocence and security. From the moment you drew your first breath, your life was a precarious gamble against disease, malnutrition, and the harsh realities of survival. If you were born, you were immediately thrust into a world that demanded resilience and adaptability, where reaching adulthood was an achievement, not a given. Infant mortality rates were staggering. It was incredibly common for half, or even more, of your siblings to die before their 5th birthday. Childhood diseases like measles, smallpox, and dysentery, for which there were no cures or vaccines, swept through communities, indiscriminately claiming young lives. Without proper sanitation, clean water, or medical understanding, a simple fever could quickly turn fatal. Imagine the constant heartbreak, the quiet grief that permeated families as they buried child after child. Parents couldn't afford to become too emotionally attached, a pragmatic defense mechanism against inevitable loss. You were taught from a young age that life was fleeting, and death was a constant companion. If you survived infancy, your childhood was not a prolonged period of play and education. Instead, it was a rapid progression into the responsibilities of adulthood. From a very young age, perhaps as young as 5 or 6, you were expected to contribute to the household economy. For peasant children, this meant helping with chores, gathering firewood, tending to animals, fetching water, or assisting in the fields. Your play was often intertwined with learning practical skills, mimicking adult tasks, helping with simpler versions of their labor. There were no designated playtimes or specialized toys beyond rudimentary homemade items. Your world was centered around survival, and every member of the family, regardless of age, had a role to play, had a education, as you understand it, was largely non-existent for the vast majority. If you were a peasant child, your school was the farm, your teachers, your parents, teaching you the necessary skills for agricultural life. Literacy was rare. Reading and writing were luxuries reserved almost exclusively for the clergy and the very wealthy. those destined for administrative roles or a life in the church. You learned through observation, imitation, and direct instruction in practical skills. Your knowledge was oral, passed down through stories, proverbs, and direct experience. Imagine a life where the written word is a mystery, and all your learning comes from watching and doing for noble children. Life was different but equally rigorous, albeit with a focus on different skills. Boys were often sent away from home around the age of 7 or 8 to serve as pages in another noble household. Here, they learned courtly manners, basic literacy often from a tutor or priest, and the rudiments of chivalry. As they grew older, they would become squires, serving a knight, learning horsemanship, weaponry, and the art of warfare. Their childhood was a strict apprenticeship, preparing them for a life of military service, administration, or leadership. Physical training was intense, and discipline was harsh. Noble girls, on the other hand, remained at home or were sent to another noble household or convent to learn the skills necessary for running a large estate. This included managing servants, overseeing household accounts, spinning, weaving, embroidery, and basic medical knowledge for the household. While some might learn to read and write, particularly if they were destined for a life in the church. Their education primarily revolved around domestic management and social graces. Their value, as we've discussed, lay in their ability to make advantageous marriages and produce heirs. Imagine your childhood being entirely dedicated to preparing for a preordained marriage and the immense responsibilities of managing a household without ever having a say in your own future. Discipline was often severe across all social classes. Physical punishment was common and widely accepted as a necessary part of raising children. Children were seen as miniature adults, not as individuals requiring special protection or emotional nurturing in the modern sense. They were expected to be obedient, respectful, and productive. The concept of teenager was absent. You transitioned directly from childhood into adult responsibilities, often marrying and starting your own family in your early to mid-teens. One unique aspect was the medieval view of childhood innocence. While modern society romanticizes childhood as a period of purity and wonder, medieval thought often viewed children as inherently sinful, needing strict discipline to guide them towards righteousness. This theological perspective contributed to the harsh treatment and expectations placed upon children from a very young age. This isn't to say parents didn't love their children, but their expressions of love and methods of raising them were profoundly shaped by their harsh reality and religious beliefs. Historians still debate the emotional impact of high infant mortality on medieval parents. While some argue it led to a degree of emotional detachment as a coping mechanism, others suggest that the grief was profound, perhaps simply expressed differently or more privately than in modern times. The constant cycle of birth, death, and new birth was an inescapable rhythm of life, shaping the emotional landscape of every family. So, as you drift deeper into sleep, consider the profound difference between your childhood and that of a medieval child. You had years of protected play, formal education, and relative safety. They faced an immediate and relentless battle for survival, their innocence often fleeting, their responsibilities beginning almost as soon as they could walk. It's a stark reminder of the immense strides humanity has made in safeguarding and nurturing its youngest generations. You feel the ache in your hands, the familiar calluses on your palms, and the persistent stiffness in your back. From dawn until dusk, your life is defined by physical exertion, a relentless cycle of toil that dictates every aspect of your existence. In the medieval world, work, wealth, and woe were intrinsically linked, creating a rigid social structure where your birth largely determined your destiny, offering little opportunity for upward mobility. The concept of climbing the corporate ladder or choosing your career path simply didn't exist. Your station in life was typically inherited, and escaping it was an almost impossible dream for the vast majority of you. the peasants. Your work is tied directly to the land. You are an agricultural laborer, working the fields from sunup to sundown, 7 days a week, with only a few feast days offering respite. Your tasks vary with the seasons plowing in spring, planting in early summer, harvesting in late summer and fall, and tending to animals year-round. You use simple, handheld tools, hoes, sickles, spades, relying on brute strength and endurance. Your muscles are constantly sore, your skin weathered by the elements. Imagine the sheer physical demands of this life. A never-ending cycle of manual labor that leaves you exhausted but with little to show for it beyond survival. Your labor is not entirely your own. As a serf, you are legally tied to the land and to the lord who owns it. You owe him not only a portion of your harvest, but also various labor services, such as working his field's domain for several days a week. You cannot leave the manor without his permission, and you cannot marry without his approval, often requiring a payment. This isn't slavery in the Roman sense, but it is a form of inherited servitude that severely limits your freedom and opportunities. Your meager harvest is your sustenance, but a significant portion of it goes to the Lord, the church as tithes and taxes. After all these deductions, you are left with just enough to survive, with little to no surplus. The idea of accumulating wealth or moving to a different village for better prospects is largely fantastical. Craftsmen and artisans in towns experienced a different kind of labor. Though still physically demanding, if you were a baker, a blacksmith, a shoemaker, or a weaver, you belonged to a guild. Guilds were powerful organizations that regulated trade, set standards for quality, and controlled who could practice a particular craft. To become a master craftsman, you would first serve as an apprentice for many years, often living with the master and receiving no pay beyond food and lodging. Then you would become a journeyman, working for wages and traveling to gain experience. Finally, if you created a masterpiece deemed worthy by the guild, you could become a master and open your own shop. This was a structured path, but it was long and arduous, requiring dedication and skill. While these workers had more autonomy than peasants and could earn a decent living, their wealth was still limited, and their lives dictated by the strict rules of their guild for women across all social classes. Work was a constant and multifaceted reality. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields, often bearing the double burden of agricultural labor and all household duties: cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, spinning, weaving, and often tending a small kitchen garden. For urban women, they might assist in their husband's trade, run small shops, or work as domestic servants. Noble women, while not engaged in manual labor, managed large households, oversaw numerous servants, handled accounts, and often held significant responsibilities in the absence of their husbands. Running the estate, their work was administrative and managerial, requiring intelligence and organizational skills. There was no concept of a leisure class for women. Every woman, regardless of status, had vital roles to fulfill. Now, consider the absolute pinnacle of medieval wealth and power, the nobility. Their work was fundamentally different. They did not toil in the fields or craft goods. Their primary responsibilities were military service as knights or commanders, administration of their lands, and dispensing justice. Their wealth came from the rents and labor services of their peasants, from taxes, and from warfare plunder. Ransoms. They lived in castles or large manors, supported by a vast network of servants and retainers, while they enjoyed immense privilege and luxury compared to the common folk. Their lives were not entirely carefree. They faced constant threats of war, rebellion, and political intrigue. Managing a large estate was a complex undertaking, requiring shrewdness and leadership. Their wealth was often measured in land and vassals, not liquid assets. One of the most defining characteristics of medieval society was the stark lack of social mobility. You were born into your station, and that was almost certainly where you would die. If you were a peasant, your children would be peasants. If you were a lord, your children would inherit your title and lands. The only significant avenue for upward mobility, albeit a non-hereditary one, was through the church, a peasant's son. If intelligent and pious, could enter the clergy, potentially rising through the ranks to become a powerful bishop or abbot. This was a rare, but vital, pathway out of inherited servitude, offering intellectual and spiritual fulfillment alongside considerable worldly power. Historians still debate the precise balance of cooperation and exploitation within the feudal system. While serfdom undeniably involved coercive labor and restrictions on freedom, some scholars argue there was a degree of mutual obligation, with the lord providing protection and land use in exchange for labor and loyalty. However, from the perspective of the peasant, the system heavily favored the powerful, leaving them vulnerable to famine, disease, and the whims of their lord. So, as you drift off to sleep, remember the heavy burden of medieval labor. Whether you were bent over a plow, hammering at an anvil, or managing a vast estate, work defined your existence. Wealth was concentrated at the very top, and for the vast majority, life was a continuous struggle for survival, marked by relentless toil and the ever-present shadow of poverty. The freedom to choose your profession, to seek economic advancement, and to escape your birthright is a modern luxury that your medieval self could only dream of. You sit by the sputtering hearth, the day's arduous labor finally done, and as the shadows lengthen, a primal human need emerges, the desire for escape, for a brief respite from the relentless grind. In the medieval world, entertainment and escapism were essential balms, often surprisingly crude, deeply communal, and intricately woven into the fabric of daily life, offering glimpses of joy amidst pervasive hardship. Forget your Netflix binges or concert tickets. Medieval leisure was about direct participation, simple pleasures, and finding amusement in the mundane, or the spectacularly violent. For the vast majority, your entertainment was born from necessity and community. Storytelling was paramount. Imagine gathering around that same hearth, the only source of light, as an elder recounts ancient legends, heroic sagas, or cautionary tales. These weren't just stories, they were history lessons, moral instruction, and a vital means of passing down cultural knowledge in a largely illiterate society. You might hear tales of King Arthur, of brave knights and mythical beasts, or perhaps more local folklore, ghost stories, and fables about cunning animals. These oral traditions were cherished, providing both diversion and a sense of shared identity. Music was another universal pleasure. Simple instruments like flutes, drums, and early stringed instruments like the rebec or lute provided accompaniment for songs, often ballads recounting historical events, laments of unrequited love, or boisterous drinking songs. Everyone participated. Singing together was a communal activity, whether during feasts, at local taverns, or simply while working in the fields. Imagine the simple joy of a shared melody, a moment of harmony in a disharmonious world. Dancing, too, was a common pastime, often spontaneous and energetic. Performed to the rhythm of the music, festivals and holy days provided the most significant breaks from routine and were eagerly anticipated. These were not just religious observances, they were opportunities for feasting, merriment, and communal gatherings. May Day celebrations, harvest festivals, and saints' days often involved pageants, processions, games, and, of course, ample food and drink. These were the moments when the entire community came together, shedding their daily burdens. If only for a few precious hours, you'd see wrestling matches, foot races, archery contests, and various forms of crude competitive sports. Now, shift your gaze to the entertainment of the nobility, a world of grander scale and often more brutal spectacles. Tournaments were the pinnacle of aristocratic entertainment, a dazzling display of martial prowess, chivalry, and pageantry. Knights, clad in shining armor, would engage in jousts, thunderous charges with lances aimed at unseating their opponents, or melees, mock battles involving groups of knights. These events were incredibly dangerous, often resulting in serious injury or even death. Yet they drew huge crowds and were a vital way for knights to prove their worth, win glory, and gain favor. Imagine the roar of the crowd, the clash of steel, the thud of a fallen knight, a visceral, high-stakes form of entertainment. Hunting, too, was a favored pastime for the nobility, often involving large retinues of huntsmen, hounds, and falcons. It was not just sport, but also a practical way to acquire meat and train for warfare. Noble ladies would often participate in hawking, a more refined form of hunting using trained birds of prey. These activities reinforced social hierarchies and provided opportunities for socializing and display of wealth. Indoor entertainment for the wealthy included games like chess, backgammon, and early forms of dice games. Minstrels and jesters were employed to provide musical performances, comedic routines, and storytelling. Imagine a traveling troupe of performers arriving at a castle, bringing news, songs, and laughter from beyond the manor gates. They were conduits of information and entertainment. Eagerly welcomed, feasts, as mentioned earlier, were elaborate affairs accompanied by music, dancing, and sometimes even dramatic performances or tableaux vivants, living pictures. One particularly intriguing and often shocking form of medieval entertainment, especially in towns and cities, was public execution, while horrifying to modern sensibilities. These events drew massive crowds and were treated as major spectacles. Heretics, criminals, and traitors would be publicly hanged, beheaded, or burned at the stake, serving as both deterrence and macabre entertainment. Imagine the morbid curiosity, the hushed whispers, and the grim satisfaction of justice being served. These were powerful communal rituals, reinforcing social order and the consequences of transgression. Another crude but popular form of entertainment was animal baiting, such as bear baiting or bull baiting, where chained animals were set upon by dogs for the amusement of onlookers. These were brutal, violent spectacles, highlighting a different set of sensibilities than our own. Such events were not only enjoyed by the common folk, but often by the nobility as well. Indicating a widespread acceptance of cruelty as entertainment, historians still debate the psychological role of such brutal entertainment in medieval society. Was it a way to vent aggression, to reinforce societal norms through fear, or simply a reflection of a harder, less empathetic age regardless? These spectacles were a stark contrast to the simple communal storytelling, offering a glimpse into the darker side of medieval leisure. So, as your mind drifts towards slumber, think about the simple yet profound ways people found joy and escape in a world that offered so little. Whether it was the shared warmth of a story by the fire, the boisterous energy of a festival, or the terrifying thrill of a joust, entertainment in the Middle Ages was never passive. It was a lived experience, deeply ingrained in the rhythm of life, and a vital mechanism for coping with the relentless pressures of a challenging world. You hear the heavy thud of a gavel, or perhaps just the stern pronouncements of the local lord. The air is thick with tension, for in the medieval world, justice, crime, and punishment were brutal, public, and often terrifyingly swift. Designed to instill fear and maintain a rigid social order. There were no elaborate courtrooms, no nuanced legal arguments as you know them today. The law was a stark, unforgiving hammer, and its blows fell heaviest on the poor and the powerless. For the common person, your encounter with justice would likely be at the local manor court or before the Lord's bailiff. These were not courts of intricate legal precedents, but rather pragmatic assemblies focused on resolving disputes, punishing minor offenses, and maintaining peace within the Lord's domain. Common crimes included petty theft, stealing a loaf of bread or a chicken could be a capital offense in times of famine. Assault, damage to property, and poaching. Remember that hunting on the Lord's land was strictly forbidden and harshly punished. As wild game was a valuable resource reserved for the nobility, punishments for these offenses were often physical and public. Designed to shame and deter, imagine being placed in the village stocks, exposed to the ridicule and thrown refuse of your neighbors. For a minor infraction, fines were common, but for those with no money, the alternative was often corporal punishment, public flogging, mutilation cutting off an ear or a hand for repeat offenders, or branding. These were not just deterrents, they were permanent markers, branding you as a criminal for life. The sheer brutality was a daily reminder of the consequences of stepping out of line for more serious crimes, like murder, rape, or treason. The stakes were much higher. These cases would often fall under the jurisdiction of royal courts or the Lord's higher court. With the ultimate punishment being death, executions were public spectacles, as we discussed, serving as a grim form of entertainment, but also as a powerful display of state authority. Hanging was common, but beheading was reserved for the nobility, a slightly more dignified end. Imagine the terror of facing such a sentence, knowing there was little hope of appeal or leniency. The role of the church in justice was also significant. Ecclesiastical courts handled matters related to the clergy, heresy, blasphemy, and moral offenses like adultery or witchcraft. Punishments could range from penance and excommunication, a terrifying prospect in a deeply religious society, as it cut you off from the sacraments and the community too. In extreme cases of heresy, being handed over to secular authorities for execution, often by burning at the stake. The fear of eternal damnation, coupled with the very real threat of earthly punishment, was a powerful force in shaping behavior. Trial by ordeal was a fascinating, albeit terrifying, aspect of medieval justice, particularly in the early Middle Ages before more formalized legal systems developed. If you were accused of a crime, you might be subjected to an ordeal by hot iron, where you would carry a heated iron for a certain distance, and your hand would then be bandaged, if after 3 days. The wound was healing cleanly, you were deemed innocent, as God had intervened. Other ordeals included ordeal by water, being thrown into water. Sinking meant innocence. Floating meant guilt, as the water rejected you, or ordeal by combat, where the accused and accuser would fight, with God supposedly granting victory to the innocent party. These practices reflect a profound belief in divine intervention in earthly affairs, a reliance on God to reveal the truth where human judgment was deemed insufficient. Trial by jury, while it sounds familiar, was very different from its modern counterpart. Early juries were often composed of local people who already knew the accused and the facts of the case, acting more as witnesses or accusers than impartial judges of evidence. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was not widely applied, often. The burden was on the accused to prove their innocence. Legal representation was rare. You largely stood alone before your accusers and judges. This often meant that justice was swift but not necessarily fair, influenced by local power dynamics, personal biases, and the social standing of the accused. For the wealthy and powerful, justice often bent to their will, while theoretically subject to the same laws. Nobles could often escape harsher punishments through influence, payments, or by simply fleeing to another lord's protection. They had the means to hire lawyers, though a nascent profession, bribe officials, or rely on family connections. This created a two-tiered system of justice, where the common person bore the brunt of the law's severity. While the elite often found ways to circumvent it, One lesser-known detail about medieval crime is the prevalence of outlawry. If you committed a serious crime and fled justice, you could be declared an outlaw, meaning you lost all legal protection. Anyone could kill you without penalty. And you were essentially cut off from society, forced to live in the wilderness or on the fringes. This was a desperate existence, highlighting the extreme consequences of defying the law and the profound importance of being recognized and protected by the legal system. Historians still debate the effectiveness of medieval punishments in deterring crime. While undeniably brutal, the constant reoccurrence of crime suggests that fear alone was not always sufficient, especially in a world riddled with poverty and desperation. However, the public nature of these punishments certainly reinforced societal norms and demonstrated the power of the ruling class. So, as you slowly drift off to slumber, reflect on a time when the law was a blunt instrument, not a finely tuned mechanism of justice. Your medieval self would have lived in constant awareness of the dire consequences of crime, navigating a world where a wrong step could lead to public humiliation, physical torment, or a swift and brutal end. The rights and protections you enjoy today are a testament to centuries of legal evolution, a profound shift from the raw, unvarnished justice of the Middle Ages. You feel a gentle breeze, not the biting cold of a medieval winter, nor the stifling heat of a summer harvest. Instead, it's a soft, comforting whisper, a sensation of release. As your journey through the medieval past draws to a close, you begin to understand that life wasn't merely about surviving the harsh realities of the era. It was also about the precious, often fleeting moments of connection and the quiet resignation to an unyielding world. As the sun begins to set on your medieval adventure, you find yourself reflecting on just how far we've truly come, and perhaps how little we sometimes appreciate the profound luxuries of our modern lives. You remember the pervasive smells, the constant grime, and the rare, almost miraculous feeling of being truly clean. You recall the taste of bland pottage, the gnawing ache of hunger, and the occasional, almost transcendent joy of a festival feast. You visualize the rough wool of your garments, a constant reminder of your station, and the distant, shimmering silks of the nobility, a world entirely beyond your reach. Every sense, every memory from this historical immersion now blends into a softer, less urgent tapestry. The loud clamor of the market, the guttural cries of animals, the drone of daily prayers. These sounds now recede into a gentle hum. You think of the rigid social structures, the fixed destinies, and the sheer impossibility of changing your lot in life. How strange it feels now. This idea of being bound to a patch of land, to a lord, to a predetermined future, with no possibility of personal ambition or escape. Yet, within that confinement, you also saw the strength of community, the shared burdens, and the simple, profound acts of mutual support that made survival possible. You recall the swift and brutal justice, the public shaming, the constant fear of arbitrary punishment, a stark contrast to the legal protections you take for granted today, the sheer vulnerability of life, the ever-present threat of disease and early death. Paints a vivid picture of a world where life was cheap, and every surviving year was a victory. You consider the brief, often terrifying, childhoods, where innocence was a fleeting luxury, and responsibility descended before you barely learned to walk. There was no cushion, no soft landing, just the expectation to contribute, to endure, to survive. As the imagery softens, you might even recall a moment of simple happiness, a communal song around a fire, the shared laughter during a festival, a moment of quiet camaraderie with a fellow laborer under the vast, indifferent sky. These tiny pinpricks of light in a challenging existence were not just pleasant distractions. They were the very threads that bound the human spirit. Allowing it to persevere despite overwhelming odds, it's a reminder that even in the most arduous circumstances, people found ways to connect, to create, and to find meaning. The harshness of medieval existence wasn't simply a matter of technology or knowledge. It was a fundamental difference in how humanity interacted with its world. The struggle for basic needs, food, shelter, safety consumed almost all energy, leaving little room for the complexities of modern personal freedom or widespread compassion. The romantic notions we often attach to the Middle Ages, often drawn from idealized tales of knights and ladies, dissolve into a far more practical, visceral reality. Now, as the last vestiges of the medieval world fade, you can truly appreciate the quiet miracle of your own life, the clean water from your tap, the abundance of food in your kitchen, the soft bed you lie in, the freedom to choose your path, to speak your mind, to love whom you wish, and to seek healing when you are sick. These are not just conveniences, they are profound gifts, hard-won over centuries of human struggle and progress. The struggles of your medieval counterpart, their daily pains and silent fears, underscore the immense privilege of the present. So, let the echoes of the past gently recede. Let the sounds of clanking armor, the smells of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, the taste of coarse bread, and the feeling of rough cloth all dissipate into the quiet hum of your own comfort. The story is told. The journey is complete. Rest now, knowing that the past, however fascinating, is truly behind you, and the peaceful embrace of your present awaits.